Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Let me start with a question that should make us all uncomfortable. When did we decide that peace negotiations mean forcing victims to surrender? Because that's exactly what we're witnessing right now with President Trump's much doubted plan to end the war in Ukraine. And I want to be very clear from the outset, this isn't peace. This is capitulation dressed up in diplomatic language, and we need to understand what's really happening here. Now, you've probably heard the headlines, 28 points, a comprehensive framework, Trump setting Thanksgiving deadlines and declaring that Ukraine's President Zelensky will simply have to like the deal. But here's what they're not telling you on the evening news. This plan requires Ukraine to surrender vast territories it still controls, accept permanent Russian occupation of Crimea and the Donbas, cap its military at a specific size, and perhaps most devastatingly promise never to join NATO, in exchange for what? Vague promises of security guarantees from an administration that's already threatening to cut military aid if Kiev doesn't sign on the dotted line. Let me put this in perspective. Imagine someone breaks into your home, occupies half of it, and then a mediator arrives and says, well, for the sake of peace, why don't you just let them keep those rooms? Oh, and you should probably agree not to install better locks or call the police in the future. That's not mediation, that's rewarding aggression. And yet this is being sold to us as pragmatic diplomacy. But to understand why this is happening, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture, the picture that mainstream media refuses to paint for you. This isn't really about Ukraine at all. It never was. Let me remind you of something I've been saying since this conflict began. Ukraine is a pawn in a much larger game. It's a flashpoint between declining American hegemony and the rising powers that challenge it. The United States has been trying desperately to maintain its global dominance for decades now, and Ukraine became the perfect pressure point to weaken Russia, a key ally of Washington's real concern, which is China. The expansion of NATO, inch by inch, closer to Russian borders, was never about Ukrainian security. It was about encircling and containing Russia, about preventing the emergence of any Eurasian power bloc that could challenge American supremacy. And here's what the architects of this strategy miscalculated terribly, catastrophically miscalculated. They believed Russia would collapse under sanctions. They predicted the ruble would become worthless, that Russia's economy would contract by 30 or 40%, that Putin's government would face internal revolt. They thought this would be quick, clean, and that Ukraine would emerge victorious with minimal Western commitment. Instead, Russia adapted. It found new markets, strengthened ties with China and India, and proved far more resilient than Western policymakers trapped in their own echo chambers ever imagined. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been devastated, millions displaced, cities reduced to rubble, an entire generation traumatized. And now, after all this suffering, after Washington encouraged Ukraine to fight on with promises of support for as long as it takes, the Trump administration is essentially telling Kiev, actually, we're tired of this. Take the deal or we'll cut you off. You see, this is where the economics that I study comes crashing into geopolitics in the most brutal way imaginable. The United States is facing its own crises, a declining dollar, massive debt, infrastructure crumbling at home, growing challenges from BRICS nations, and an inability to maintain its global military presence at previous levels. Europe, too, is economically stagnating after cutting itself off from cheap Russian energy. The war has become expensive, and the returns on investment aren't what Washington hoped for. So now we get this peace plan. And let me tell you what this plan really represents. It's an acknowledgement of failure wrapped in the language of deal-making. It's Trump trying to extract himself from a quagmire that he inherited, but that American foreign policy created over decades of reckless expansion and imperial overreach. Consider the details that have emerged. Ukraine must recognize Russian control over territories Moscow doesn't even fully occupy yet. Ukraine must withdraw from areas it currently holds and watch them become demilitarized zones under Russian sovereignty. All parties receive amnesty for war crimes, yes, you heard that right, complete amnesty. And somehow all of this is supposed to be monitored by a peace council, chaired by President Trump himself. It's almost Orwellian in its audacity. European leaders are horrified, and rightly so. Poland's prime minister called parts of it unacceptable. Germany removed some of the more egregious provisions in subsequent drafts. Even Republicans like Mitch McConnell have warned that this looks like appeasement of Putin. When you've lost Mitch McConnell on being too soft on Russia, you know something has gone terribly wrong. But here's what troubles me most as an economist and as someone who studied the history of capitalism and empire. This pattern repeats itself over and over again. Great powers drag smaller nations into their conflicts, promise them the world, and then abandon them when the costs become inconvenient. We saw it in Afghanistan when the United States armed the Mujahideen against the Soviets, then walked away, leaving chaos in its wake. We saw it in Iraq, in Libya, in countless Cold War proxy battles across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And now we're seeing it again in Ukraine. The profit motive that drives capitalist expansion, the need to secure markets, resources, and geopolitical advantage, has added a particularly ruthless dimension to warfare throughout modern history. Wars become investments. Human suffering becomes a line item in strategic calculations. And when the investment stops paying returns, when the stock price of American hegemony keeps falling despite massive military expenditures, then the investors, the foreign policy establishment, military, industrial complex, the political class, they start looking for an exit strategy. Trump's plan is that exit strategy. It's not about justice for Ukraine. It's not about protecting democracy or sovereignty or any of the high-minded principles we heard so much about in the early days of the invasion. It's about cutting losses and moving on. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but Professor Wolff, isn't any peace better than continued war? Shouldn't we just want the killing to stop? And believe me, I understand that sentiment. Every day this war continues, more people die, more families are destroyed, more futures are stolen. Of course we want the killing to stop, but here's the question we must ask ourselves. What kind of peace are we creating, and what precedent does it set? If great powers learn that they can invade their neighbors, absorb territory through force, and then have that conquest legitimized through peace agreements, backed by the world's supposed defender of the international order, what does that mean for the future? What message does it send to China regarding Taiwan, to other authoritarian regimes eyeing their neighbors' territory? What happens to the entire post-World War II framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of aggressive territorial expansion? The uncomfortable truth is that this plan, if implemented as currently structured, rewards aggression and punishes resistance. It tells Ukraine and countries like it that Western security guarantees are worthless when they become expensive. It demonstrates that might still makes right, despite all our talk about international law and human rights. And let's talk about those security guarantees that are supposedly part of the deal. What do they actually mean? The United States couldn't even maintain its commitment to support Ukraine with weapons, and funding Trump himself threatened to cut aid to force this agreement. So what credibility do American security promises have? Are we really supposed to believe that if Russia violates this agreement and pushes further into Ukrainian territory, the United States will suddenly decide to respond with a decisive, coordinated military response the plan vaguely mentions, after years of carefully avoiding direct confrontation with Russia, after watching red line after red line get crossed without meaningful consequences? These are paper promises. backed by a declining empire that increasingly lacks both the resources and the political will to enforce them. So where does this leave us? Well, let me suggest a few things we should be paying attention to, because I don't think this story ends with this plan being signed, sealed, and delivered. First, watch the European response. Europe has the most to lose from a precedent that rewards Russian aggression. If Ukraine falls entirely into Russia's sphere of influence through coercive diplomacy, Europe's eastern flank becomes dramatically more vulnerable. Germany, France, Poland, the Baltic states, they understand this in a way that Washington, protected by two oceans, perhaps doesn't. There's already significant pushback from European capitals, and that resistance may intensify. Second, watch the internal dynamics in Ukraine itself. The Ukrainian people have endured unimaginable hardship. They've shown remarkable resilience and determination. Zelensky is facing an impossible situation. Accept terms that look like defeat or face abandonment by Ukraine's primary military backer. But the Ukrainian parliament, civil society, and military may not simply go along with what they see as capitulation. Political instability in Kiev could follow if this deal moves forward, potentially creating yet another crisis. Third, watch Russia's response. Putin hasn't officially accepted this plan either. Why would he? From his perspective, the momentum is on his side. The West is tired, divided, and looking for an exit. Ukraine is exhausted and running low on ammunition and soldiers. Why would Putin lock himself into an agreement now when he might be able to extract even more concessions by simply waiting? The Kremlin has been notably quiet about the details, and that silence is telling. And finally, watch what this means for the broader international order. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with new members, are watching very carefully. They see Western hypocrisy, they see American imperial overreach coming home to roost, and they see opportunity. Every misstep by Washington, every broken promise, every cynical abandonment of stated principles, it all feeds into the narrative that a multipolar world order is not only possible but necessary. The American empire is in decline. That's not a controversial statement among serious observers anymore. It's simply a fact. The question is how that decline will be managed, and what kind of world will emerge on the other side. Trump's Ukraine plan, regardless of whether it succeeds or fails, is a symptom of that decline. It represents an empire realizing it can no longer afford the costs of maintaining its position, looking for ways to extract itself from commitments that have become burdensome. Now, I want to be clear about something before I close. I'm not defending Russian aggression. The invasion of Ukraine was illegal under international law and has caused immeasurable suffering. Nothing I've said should be interpreted as justification for Putin's actions. What I am saying is that we need to understand the full context of how we got here and who benefits from the solutions being proposed. The fundamental problem is the system itself, a global capitalist system organized around competing empires, profit maximization, and the exploitation of working people in the service of elite interests, whether those elites are in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, or Brussels. They play the same game. They talk about democracy, sovereignty, and peace while pursuing power, profit, and control. And it's ordinary people, Ukrainian families huddling in bomb shelters, Russian conscripts sent to die in foreign fields, working families in America and Europe paying higher prices for everything because of sanctions and disrupted trade who bear the costs. Until we fundamentally challenge and change these structures, until we build economic systems based on cooperation rather than competition, on meeting human needs rather than maximizing profits, on genuine democracy rather than elite decision making, we will see this pattern repeat itself again and again. Different countries, different flashpoints, but the same underlying dynamics. So what can we do? First, we must see through the propaganda from all sides. Question the narratives, understand the economic interests at play, recognize that governments don't speak for their people, they speak for the class interests they represent. Second, we must build solidarity with working people across borders. Ukrainian workers, Russian workers, American workers, we have more in common with each other than any of us have with the billionaires and oligarchs who profit from our divisions. And third, we must imagine and work toward alternative ways of organizing our economies and societies. The workers' cooperatives I've spent my career advocating for are one piece of that puzzle: democratic workplaces where decisions are made by those affected by them, not by distant elites pursuing their own agendas. Trump's peace plan will probably fail in its current form. It may be modified, watered down, or abandoned entirely as the various parties maneuver for advantage. But even in failure, it reveals important truths about the world we live in, about declining American power, about the costs of imperial overreach, about the disposability of small nations caught between great power conflicts, and about the urgent need for fundamentally different approaches to international relations and economic organization. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy, and any genuine peace would be welcome. But peace without justice is just a temporary ceasefire, a setup for future conflicts. What we need isn't clever deal-making that rewards aggression while pretending to be pragmatic. What we need is an honest reckoning with the systemic forces that produce these conflicts in the first place, and a commitment to building something better. That's the real work ahead of us, not signing flawed peace deals that paper over fundamental injustices, but transforming the economic and political structures that make such injustices inevitable. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has given you some food for thought. The situation in Ukraine is complex, rapidly evolving, and deeply consequential for all of us. Whatever happens in the coming weeks and months, let's commit to seeing it clearly, understanding it deeply, and learning the lessons it has to teach us about power, empire, and the possibility for a different kind of world. Thank you.